الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والذين آمنوا أشد حب لله صدق الله العظيم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. One of the things that helps us understand things in life is when we put names on things. Allah Ta'ala, He created Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam to know, so He taught him the names. When women in the 1950s and 1960s, when they got together to discuss how their husbands had been treating them, they made a name for it. They called it domestic violence, and they worked to end it. When Chinese peasants in the countryside in the early 1900s got together to discuss what was going on in their lives, they put a name on it. They called it feudalism, and they worked to end it. And one of the biggest problems that we see in our lives today, in the society in which we live, is something called hedonism. Hedonism is the belief that following someone's own desires is the highest good you can achieve in this life. Now, this is something, for a lot of people, it's the default in life, that they just follow their own desires. And as long as that's going okay, then life's going okay. But it never lasts for long. And then there are other people called ethical hedonists. Ethical hedonists, they believe that you follow your own desires as long as you don't hurt anybody else. But one problem you always run into, and you'll be hard-pressed to find a single ethical hedonist who can say that we can live our lives the way that we are, and it's not hurting anybody else. If you're buying, clothing or anything from one of these major stores that we all shop at, you're hurting some of those workers. I drove my car here. I'm hurting the environment. There was a news report a couple weeks ago. This is something that should shock people. I'm amazed that religious people, we oftentimes get shocked about if there's an earthquake somewhere, or we think it's the end of times. And those things are things to take seriously, but there was an article a couple weeks ago that 50% of the organisms on this planet have died in the last 40 years. 50% of the living things on this planet have died in the last 40 years. That's something that should make people shake. That's something we should tremble over. And unless you're a person living in the forest without any clothes and starving yourself, you're hurting something when you're buying some product somewhere. So, how do we get out of this trap? SubhanAllah, one way to think of it, the scholars, they talked about this to people who are just living their life and they don't have any problems. People don't have any problems, they don't tend to think about things. This is one reason why tribulation from God, it's something that helps us. It makes a person focus and think about their place in life. So the scholars, they ask people to imagine a person walking on an empty plain. An empty grassy plain. They're just walking and they're enjoying themselves, and there's sunlight and everything's going fine. And then all of a sudden they see a lion staring at them in their eyes. And the lion looks vicious. So what does this person do? They start to run. And they run as fast as they can. Until they keep running until they find a well. And this man, he jumps inside the well. As he's going down into the well to get away from the lion, he sees an herb sticking out of the side of the well like a root. He grabs onto it and holds on, because when he looks down, what does he see at the bottom? He sees these vicious snakes circling around in the bottom of the well, and they're looking up at him and opening their jaws, and he's scared to death. So now this man, he looks up and he sees the lion looking down at him. And he looks down and he sees those snakes opening their jaws. And then he looks at that root, and what does he see? He sees two mice, a black mouse and a white mouse, and they're going around the root, and they're eating away at that root. And now what does this guy do? As he's there in that position, he looks at that root, and he notices there's some honey on the end of the root, and he looks at that honey, and he starts to eat it. And he's happy for a few minutes. Now everyone would think that person's foolish. Everyone would think that person, what's he doing? But the scholars say that that person is us. Because that open plain of life, that's how we are when our life's going good. And then when we're getting chased by our problems, we try to run away from them, and then the world becomes straightened for us. And it becomes narrow, and we jump in that well. And then when you're holding on to that root is your life. And it's eventually going to get eaten away by the white mouse days and by the black mouse nights. And as they're eating away, you look down and your inevitable end is the death, those snakes at the bottom. And what are we doing? We're taking these little enjoyments in life, these little comforts, and we're losing ourselves in them. Like that person, just eating away the little sweetness off that root. It's silly. So what's the way out? وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold on to the rope of Allah Ta'ala altogether. The scholars, the Imam Jalaluddin al-Rumi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that there's one ayah in the Quran, it deceived more people than any other ayah. Not because there's any falsehood in it, but he said the ayah, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold on to the rope of Allah altogether. People, we listen to this, and we think if we hold on to it, we're safe. But the rope of Allah Ta'ala is there for you to ascend, for you to become closer to God. Not so you can just become content with yourself and think, I've done it all. I'm okay, I pray 5 times a day. I fast in Ramadan, I'm done now. No, Allah Ta'ala gave this to us, gave this deen to us so it becomes something better. One person, he asked one of the shuyukh, he asked them about the spiritual path in Islam. And the shaykh responded in an ajib way. He said that this path, it begins with إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, and it ends with أَن تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ. That this deen, it begins with actions are according to intentions, that you purify your heart, you realize that this life is going to end, and the pleasures of this life are going to leave you. And then you ascend through this deen, and you practice this deen, and you purify your heart through it, and you become a better person through it, until you worship Allah Ta'ala as if you see Him. That's what it means. And Allah Ta'ala, the most precious thing that we have in our lives is our iman, to be a mu'min. This is the most precious thing that we have. This is our most precious possession. And Allah Ta'ala, He tells us in so many ayat, what does it mean to be a mu'min? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. If you claim to believe in Allah Ta'ala, what does that mean? Ittaqillah, that you have fear of Allah, that you have be conscious and aware of Allah Ta'ala, that you have sabr. And we all know these ayat, but there's one ayah that Allah Ta'ala, He said something very special. He didn't say, oh, you who believe, do this. He said, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبُّ لِلَّهِ. And those who believe are intense, are ardent, are passionate in their love for God. It's not something like you can go do it, because if you're a believer, you already have it. If you believe in Allah Ta'ala, this is like the intrinsic nature of iman, that you believe in Allah, that you love Him more than everything else. That's what it means to be a mu'min. Some people that ask, what is this mahabba, what does it mean to love Allah Ta'ala? The scholars, they say, one of the poets said it best. He said that we gathered everything in the world that causes heartache, we put it all together, and we called it ishq. We called it love. Anything that causes pain in your heart. Because love isn't something that you just feel lukewarm about it. Love is often described as fire, right? Because it makes you move. We're living in a time where people, they live in this comfort. I always ask my students, I ask them, how many of you have been to the countries where your parents are from? They raise their hand. I said, how many of you didn't have electricity all day long? They all raise their hand. How many of you didn't have water, warm water all day long? They raise their hand. We live in this comfortable life. We often don't think about these things. And one aspect of living this comfortable life, that people become complacent about these issues. That when you have everything going easy for you, you're living in the OC bubble, and you have a nice neighborhood, and you don't see any poor people, and you don't really care about all the problems in the environment, because that's really happening in other places, that they're having all these floods and whatnot, not really us, then it's easy to just be complacent. It's easy to just go with the flow. But if someone has love in their heart, no, it drives you. If someone has love in their heart, it forces you to do something. So we live this complacent life. We often hear people say nowadays, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And that can mean a lot of things. For some people, it means that they're not going to be an extremist. It means that they're not going to shove their beliefs down someone else's throat. And that's not a bad thing. But for a lot of people, it means, I pray when I feel like it sometimes. And I fast when I feel like it sometimes. But if someone is a believer, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبُّ لِلَّهِ, you don't have a choice. It's something that it drives your heart. Rasulullah sallallahu Aisha radiallahu anha narrates about him that at the time of the night, when the lovers would go to their beloved, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam would get up and go to his beloved. He would go and he'd pray in front of Allah Ta'ala. We have all of these du'as in these books, the sunnah du'as, the du'as that Rasulullah used to say. and there's a dua for waking up, and there's a dua for going to sleep, and there's a dua for drinking, and a dua for eating, and a dua for putting on your clothes, and taking off your clothes, and everything. And why was that? Because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Habibullah. He was the beloved of God, and he loved God. And when someone loves someone else, they take pleasure and respite in thinking about the one they love. And Rasulullah was always thinking about Allah Ta'ala, non-stop. And that's what it means to be a believer, that you have this love. That's what it means to be a believer, that you recognize the blessings of the person that you love. The scholars, they say that love means to give preference to somebody else. And this is the purpose of our life. The scholars, they say that if I came and I put a shovel in your hands, if I walk up to you and I give you a shovel, it means that most likely I'm going to ask you to dig something. If I come up to you and I put a knife in your hands, most likely I'm going to ask you to cut something. Allah Ta'ala, He made you and He put a heart in your chest because you were made to know and love Allah Ta'ala. We are put on this earth to know. The scholars, they say that insan, the Arabic word for human being, it comes from uns, the ability to love and have affinity for something else. Because that's our purpose in this life, to know and love Allah Ta'ala. And this is what drives us in the deen. That those people who they don't work on this, because mahabba, it comes from the word habba, seed. And every single one of us has the seed of love in our heart, but you have to nurture it and make it grow. And some of us, we dry out the seed. We starve that seed with our desires and our sins. But if we want to grow, in that love, then we have to do those things that will bring that love into our hearts. And the scholars, they say that if somebody loves somebody else, it's a very simple process. It's a very simple process all of us know, because we've all had this ability, inshallah, to love something in this life, because that's the nature of a human being. They say that when somebody loves somebody else, the first step of that is raghba, desire. That when somebody sees someone and they become interested in that person. And what happens when that interest is there? Then that person has talab. They seek out information about that person. They want to know more about that person. Until they know so much about this person, they become so infatuated with this person that we call it mahabba. They love that person. And then there's a saying common in English. Everybody can move forward, please, because there's people and there's room in the second hall and there's room upstairs. If we can all move forward, fill in all the gaps. Nobody block the doors, please. That they love someone so much that it's commonly said about a man that he loves her so much he worships the ground that she walks on. So the scholars, they say to focus our hearts away from all the things in this world that pull us away. A simple thing that you can say to remind yourself is La marghubi illallah. There is nothing I desire except for Allah. La matlubi illallah. There's nothing I'm seeking out except for Allah. La mahbubi illallah. There's nothing that I love except for Allah. La ilaha illallah. There's nothing that I worship except for Allah Ta'ala. And the two things in this life that make us distracted from this path are ghafla, heedlessness, not paying attention to the signs around us, and desires. And the scholars, they mention that, and Allah Ta'ala mentions, that everything in this world is an ayah. Allah Ta'ala says it so many times. وَآيَةٌ لَهُمْ. And a sign for them is this, and a sign for them is this, and a sign for them is this. When I was a kid, when I was growing up, we used to have these old computers. And in those old computers, if you wanted to do something, you had to go into MS-DOS and do, underscore, backslash, some game that you wanted to play, because I was 7 years old, and then colon, and then you do it, right? It was very difficult. And then what they did is they made this interface windows that you point and click. If you're old enough, you remember they had all these advertising point and click. It made it so easy, right? And computer language is called binary code. It's a string of zeros and ones. But it's very hard for people to understand, so they make this interface so you can understand it. Right? And Allah Ta'ala, every single thing in this world is an ayah, it's a sign for you, it has meaning. And if they still can't understand it, then Allah Ta'ala gave you this interface, the Quran Sharif, so you understand His ayat. Allah Ta'ala called Sayyidina Musa to him, and he said, La ilaha illa ana, fa'budni wa aqim as-salati li dhikri. If you don't understand what it means, this life, if you don't understand what it means that you're loved, if you don't understand what it means when you die, then Allah Ta'ala made it clear, there is no God except for me. So worship me and establish prayer for my remembrance. And every verse in the Quran, we don't call it a verse, we call it an ayah because it's a sign. And everything in this world, we don't just call it a thing, we call it an ayah because it's a sign. And if you don't understand those signs, then go back to Allah Ta'ala's guidance in plain, simple language, and you will understand what those signs mean. God made it simple for you. He made an interface for you. He made it so there's no way that someone can be confused if they're truly seeking it out. But for that purpose, for that person who covers their eyes, and they don't want to know, and they shut themselves out. Mawlana Rumi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that if you're sitting in a room, don't curse the fact that you don't have moonlight. Open up one of your windows and let that light into you. Open up a door and let that light come into you. And it's up to us to open our hearts to that mahabbah, to open our hearts to that ishq, so that we can become closer to God, so that we can understand life, so that we can become purified. And what's the worst part about it is that when we have all of these ayat, when we have all of these things that God gave us so that we can realize that level of أَن تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَى, what do? We turn it into simple rituals. When I was going for Hajj, subhanAllah, people just came back from Hajj. When I was going for Hajj a few years ago, I remember I came out of the Hilton Hotel, and our Hajj group, they gave us this bag. They said it's a special bag for you to carry your shoes in. Like, don't lose this bag, because everybody lose their shoes at Hajj. We don't want you to lose your shoes. You take this bag, you carry wherever you go. Okay. So I was 19 years old coming out of the Hilton Hotel. And you're going down this long corridor to get to the Haram Sharif, to get to the Kaaba. And on both sides of there's these big glossy windows, and there's mannequins, and they're selling all these luxurious items, and you're on your way to the Baytullah. And as I was walking out, I was about to reach the street, and the street, there's so many people there, and it's there's a lot of people, and it's not so clean in some places, and there's an odor. And I was walking out onto the street, and I saw 4 people. And these people, they must have been from Afghanistan or Northwest Pakistan or something. They were so old. I remember they were so old that their hair, it wasn't even white anymore, it was like yellow. And these 3 men were standing in a semicircle, and there was a woman that was part of their group, and she was walking over me. She was a heavy-set woman, and she was walking, and she was carrying a big garbage bag. And as she walked up to those men, her hand slipped, and the bag fell on that street, and it split open, and what was inside? Hot steaming rice. And these 3 men that were old and they had white hair, they all bent down on the floor and they started picking up that rice and they started eating it as fast as they could. And I remember stopping and thinking, I'm 19 years old and I have a bag for my shoes better than these people have a bag for their food. And God didn't give me all this stuff because He likes me. God didn't give us all these things because He just likes us. God gave us this because He wants us to undergo a test, to understand the meaning of this life, so that we can give out of love and realize what it means to be loved, because love is sacrifice. Love means preferring something more important than other things that are less important. Love means having priorities. And love doesn't just mean going and praying and standing all pious when people outside are suffering. Love doesn't just mean that I'm going to stand here and take care of my heart while other people's hearts are being broken, while other people's dreams are being shattered. Love means that you pick up your brothers and your sisters. Love means that you help the people in your community. Love means that you burst the bubble that we're living in and you go out and you help the people that maybe they're not standing in front of you crying, but you know that they're out there. May Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq. May Allah Ta'ala understand the reality of the message. And may Allah Ta'ala let us live up to it. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله. Part of being a responsible person, part of being a Muslim who has this love in their heart for God and love in their heart for God's creation. It means taking care of the creation. And it's not enough that we say, brother, I'll make dua for you. There's one story about Sayyidina Ibn Abbas anhu, that he was once doing i'tikaf. And a man came and he sat inside the masjid. This was the Masjid Nabawi Sharif, the Prophet's mosque. And that man, he sat in front of Ibn Abbas, and Ibn Abbas anhu said, you look so worried, is there something wrong? And the man said, there is something wrong. I'm deeply in debt to some other person and I'm worried about it. And Ibn Abbas, he said, do you want me to go talk to that man for you? And that man, he said, I'd love it if you did that. It'd take a lot of pressure off me. So Ibn Abbas, he got up right away and he was making i'tikaf. You stay and you seclude yourself in the mosque. But he got up and he walked outside. And the man, he was kind of dumbfounded. He said, did you forget what you were doing? And did you forget that you were doing i'tikaf, that you were secluded inside the masjid? And Ibn Abbas turned around, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, no, I didn't forget, because the occupant of this grave, meaning Rasulullah ﷺ, he told me, and it wasn't too long ago, that if a person meets his brother, and he goes and he sets out on foot walking to relieve his brother's condition, it's better than doing 10 years of i'tikaf. And doing one single day of i'tikaf, Allah Ta'ala rewards you, He'll put space between you and Jahannam like the east and the west. Protect you from that. And doing this one act, it gives you 10 years of i'tikaf. It's not enough for us that when we see them in pain, we say, I'll make dua for you, brother. This is what we say, I'll make dua for you, brother. It's not enough to have goodwill. We're living in a society with structural racism. We're living in a society that's the environment's being degraded and destroyed. We're living in a society where poor people are swept away so that we don't see them. We're living in a society that has all these problems. It's not enough just to pray harder. If somebody doesn't make Hajj, if somebody doesn't fast in Ramadan, we say that that person is liable to face the justice of God on the Day of Judgment. And if we don't fulfill our fard kifaya, if we don't fulfill our societal obligations, our communal obligations, to take care of the people around us, and it's not something you can fix just by putting a $20 bill in some guy's hand. It's something that we have to get together collectively to solve, then you're liable to face the justice of God on the Day of Judgment. So, to this end, alhamdulillah, the masjid, they've invited a couple people to come and speak to us after the salah. They've invited Robert Ming, the former mayor and a current councilman for Laguna Niguel, and Mrs. Lisa Bartlett, the current mayor of Dana Point. And they're both running for the OC supervisorial position in the 5th district, and they're going to be having a program right after this. Now, it's one thing to talk about the problems of the world and to say that, we can't solve it on our own, or maybe we can't even solve it in our community. But it's something else just to pay lip service to that heartache you feel when you look around, and something else to do something about it. And we might not always agree about it, and we might not always see eye to eye, but it's the first step in any society that's functioning is to talk about it. And Rasulullah told us this principle of shura, this principle of consultation. This is what healthy societies are built on, talking face to face, talking to each other and understanding each other's problems. So if anybody wants to stay, they're highly encouraged to stay right after the salah. There's also going to be the Eid Carnival this Sunday. It's going to be between 11 and 4. Today is the last chance to buy tickets. There's going to be a Quran class this Friday, or tonight at 5 p.m. And there's also going to be a youth group at 7 p.m. And we're also going to have the CARE annual banquet, which is going to be November 8th at the Anaheim Hilton Hotel. Tawakkul Kirman is going to be there. She's the first Arab woman to receive the Nobel Prize, and also some other speakers. So may Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq that we don't just listen to these things. It's easy to give a speech. It's something else to try to solve these problems. We'll end by sending blessings on Sayyidina Rasulullah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna 'alan nabi. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sallu 'alayhi wa sallimu taslima. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik 'ala sayyidina Muhammadin 'abdika wa rasulik wa salli 'ala al-mu'minina wal mu'minat wal muslimina wal muslimat wa alif bayna qulubihim wa aslih dhata baynihim wansurhum 'ala 'aduwwika wa 'ala 'aduwwihim. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik 'ala sayyidina ومولانا وأزواجه وذريته. قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أرحم أمتي بأمتي أبو بكر وأشدهم في أمر الله عمر وأصداقهم حياء عثمان وأقضاهم علي وفاطمة سيدة نساء أهل الجنة والحسن والحسين سيدا شباب أهل الجنة وحمزة أسد الله وأسد رسولي. اللهم اغفر للعباس وولدي مغفرة ظاهرة وباطنة لا تغادر ذنبا. الله في أصحابي لا تتخذوهم غردا من بعدي فمن أحبهم فبحبي أحبهم ومن أبغضهم فببغضي أبغضهم وخير وخير أمتي قرني ثم الذين يلونهم ثم الذين يلونهم. عباد الله رحمكم الله، إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم ولذكر الله تعالى أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون. وأقيموا الصلاة.